Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everybody. Ryan here with a bit of a return to old form. Today I have a blind amplifier shootout for you with the Marshall Valvestate 8100 once again being the star of the show. If you haven't been around the channel since before the pandemic times, shall we say, then you might not know or may not remember that I've done a few of these with stuff like the Mesa Boogie amplifiers I own, or Randall Thrasher, comparing them to amplifiers or gear in its class, whether it be a pedal or plug-in, trying to emulate similar tones to show the capabilities of each one and how close you can get with different types of emulations of that amplifier. And today is going to be kind of a similar exercise. Going to be a little more expanded, a little bit broader in scope than I've done in the past, but that's kind of been the theme of my channel the past few years, where videos just continued to bloat, both in budget and time. So if you don't know the drill, we'll first go through all of the tones blind, labeled amp 1 through 6 in this case. There's going to be this amplifier that was used as the reference tone with all other amps trying to match that sound, and I use amps in air quotes because some of them are not amplifiers. Some of them are not even physical devices at all, but they are taking the role of the valve state in the signal chain. To kind of level the playing field and get rid of some other potential variables, we're going to use a cabinet impulse response. We're going to use one each for each of the sections to kind of dial in different sounds and use cases for this amplifier. Because the 8100 and potentially other contestants in this shootout have a physical power amp, I'm going to use the surreactive load as usual to interface with my impulse response loader. Being that this is a solid state power amp, it's probably not as sensitive, and no load at all would be okay, but if there is some negative feedback, current drive, tube-like configuration going on in the power amp, I would rather be safe than sorry, and it's one less variable between the similar types of gear being demonstrated here. Just like previous valve state videos, this is going to be the guitar or the DI that's reamped, in this case, straight through the amplifier. So all the other gear is going to have to contend with that because this amp can handle straight through the amp tones beautifully. It has a ton of saturation and gain on tap while still remaining articulate. And of course, the onboard contour control is basically the big 700, 800 hertz scoop at the desk built right in. So this is going to be a tough cookie to match, I believe, in this shootout. The second set of riffs I demonstrate do have the reverb dialed in just a little bit in the mix. It's really hardly noticeable actually, but it just adds a little bit of space and air to those slower sections. This and potentially other amplifier type gear in the shootout will have that reverb control, but for those that don't, I'll just use a plug-in. It's not the star of the show here, but just to show that, you know, this is something that is potentially emulatable throughout any sort of space, whether you're using pedals or a plug-in or a full-blown amp modeler. The last thing I'll say before we get into the shootouts, just to get on my soapbox for just a few seconds here, I see this growing sentiment, and maybe this is just kind of like a edgelord, oh, I'm so cool for being a contrarian, I don't know, but there seems to be a lot of people that keep this mentality that shootouts are totally pointless because people do them wrong, or who cares about those differences because you can compensate for them anyway. And in a practical, pragmatic standpoint, I agree with that. But when performed correctly and reflecting the way people are actually using this gear, I think it is an invaluable tool. Just personally speaking, that's the kind of stuff I want to see if I'm interested in purchasing a new amplifier or cabinet or pedal, is to see, well, here's something that compares it to other gear in its class, and you might already own some of that gear in its class. Can you dial it in to essentially perform the same job? And in this case, we're going to see, are there lower cost alternatives? Are there things that you might already own that you can just, you know, augment and get that same sort of sound? Or is this something you kind of have to purchase to get this kind of tone? And so I don't like this growing sentiment that shootouts are totally pointless and they're all wrong and there's no value in them, because it's just not true. And for all products out there, but especially our little guitar tone generators, there's really no way to discuss certain aspects of them without talking about them in a comparative manner, to show, to demonstrate where one breaks down and the other one excels, or vice versa, where they're equally matched and where it may not matter in this case. So no shootout's going to be 100% thorough, but I think it's a totally valid way to show them off when things are equally measured and there's as many variables isolated as possible, but also realistically isolated. This is a video I could have tone matched every one of these and made them sound way more alike than they otherwise would, just like I have in a previous Shootout video, but that's not representative of the way people are using this stuff most of the time. And we're really here to discern what are those differences, how are they different when you get them as close as possible. So that's all I got for that little tangent, but it's been a while since I've done a Shootout, so I wanted to address that first. But for this section, listen to this isolated, blind comparison of the Valvestate and its competitors. Leave a comment down below if you'd like to say which one you think is the Valvestate, or simply which one you think has the most Valvestate character, which one's your favorite, and then we'll talk about the gear on offer. Obviously, one of the contestants is our reference model 8100 with contour dialed up at least above noon and gain very high, if not completely maxed out. As I said earlier, this is kind of a tough cookie to crack because no other solid-state amplifier that I've played in this room really does what this does just plugging straight into it. You can help out other amplifiers and get a similar response, but it's kind of crazy what they were able to accomplish with this circuit, especially around the time that it released. The question is, can Marshall actually do that again? And have they been able to even replicate or emulate this sound within the same series of amplifiers? Alrighty. So this is the Marshall Valvestate 8200 Bichorus. Many people get these two confused. They are of the same amplifier lineage, they're in the same series, but unlike the Mono 8100, this has an onboard stereo power amplifier section, a stereo chorus section that can be alternated between two different modes, but also a stereo effects loop, which means you can put all kinds of crazy stuff through this in a stereo cabinet or a pair of mono cabinets and get some really wide stereo effects, obviously. We're not going to be taking advantage of any of that, but we wanted to see here if this boost channel is the same as this one. As on paper, if you look at the schematics, they are seemingly identical, at least until you get to the tube gain stage. And even then, a lot of people remark that, well, the tube doesn't even matter. It's just there for volume and a little bit of saturation. So if that's the case, they should sound basically identical, minus some component drift and whatever, tolerances that are different between the components that were selected. So very much going to be interested to hear how this stacks up to the 8100, because in theory, you get a stereo version of this, and this is the functionality you want, there's no reason to own both, right? The stereo nature of recording this through a single load box, though, is a bit challenging, which is where my custom Dirtmonger Instruments load box comes into play. This is an absolutely sick enclosure. Huge thanks once again to Dirtmonger for making this custom for me. It actually has 3 different inputs because I can use this in kind of a master-slave configuration, or if I'm working on an amplifier, take advantage of this. They're actually switchable between different loads. But for this one, I'm just going to use this as the stereo load going through the right side, coming from the right side rather. One of the other amplifier contestants has been hanging out in the back of the frame the entire video, the Randall RG100ES, an amplifier we've taken a look at in depth quite a few times now, and it has a different philosophy to emulate tube amplifier sounds, whereas this is a hard clipper section going through a real preamp tube. There's no tubes involved with the Randall, and it uses transistors instead. So basically every tube gain stage that you would see in a hot-rodded Marshall-style circuit, that uses a transistor and some filtering instead. And as a result, a lot of people, including myself, thinks it has a really good tube-like response in a lot of ways, especially without the master volume ran too high. If you know anything about the RG100, though, you probably know it's not a dime bag machine in a box, and all of the users of that amp typically boost it with something rather high output, like a Metal Zone ran cleanish, or a couple passes of equalization, which is what we're going to be doing today. Up front, I've boosted it with this DB Effects from the Philippines. Wonder who that's named after. Parametric EQ 404 to emulate the classic Furman unit, dialed in to basically kind of give it a little bit of a high mids bump and just a little shaving off of the low end. And of course, an overall output level boost to attempt to dial in the same amount of brightness and saturation you hear on the 8100. Now, that alone isn't going to quite cut it because, as we've discussed before, this onboard contour control present on both of these amps isn't something that's really easily replicable with a standard tone stack. You can't even do it on this amp with any standard Marshall type tone stack, which is what the RG100 has. So in the loop, I'm running this W&D parametric EQ, so this makes a double EQ setup. This one, of course, scooping out some of those mids and just giving a little bit of a high bump and a low cut. And I dialed back the output level just a hair to not overdrive the power section of that amp, as it kind of starts sounding a little boxy, in my opinion, when you give it too much signal. The next contender isn't something you can even physically touch, as it lives in the digital space. The Audiority Solidus, which is, to my knowledge, the only plugin out there that truly emulates the 8100 and advertises it as such. This is a kind of all-in-one suite that includes pre-EQ and boost functionality. Post-EQ actually comes with their free Dr. Drive that we discussed in an earlier video, and a smattering of free impulse responses that come with it. And overall, it's a very nice usable package. Of course, I'm disabling most of that and just comparing it head-to-head with the Valvestate 100. Now, to kind of maybe spoil some potential results here, I unfortunately did have to use the EQ in both the pre and post application to get it to sound as close as I did to this amplifier. Now, whether this is just a freak accident and this thing just rips and sounds way better than they ever intended it to, or there are some problems in emulating the sound with the plugin, I had to basically boost and cut some frequencies up front and cut some frequencies in post to make it sound more amp-like. It could be as simple as, well, there's no load emulation on the power amplifier side, or maybe it's just like the straight preamp output. Who really knows? Whatever the case, there are more tricks involved than just that amplifier plugin, unfortunately. Our final two contestants are back in the real world, but neither of them are actually amplifiers. And I know at least a few of you are on the edge of your seats saying, show it, I've been asking for this for months, and here you are. The big payoff, the Master Effects Martyr. Supposedly an all-in-one pedal to emulate the OD2 boost channel. There used to be an OD1 switch apparently on older units in a bigger enclosure, but the pedal builder said no one was using that, so shrunk it down and made something that just did the, the brutal death metal tones. Now, unlike our other amplifier contestants, this one actually has a contour control just like the real Valvestate. So that should help it get a lot closer, but it is missing one piece of the puzzle. That is, of course, the power amplifier. Now, I could plug this straight into an interface as just a preamp and rely completely on a impulse response to do the heavy lifting, but to equalize everything as much as possible, I ran this into the effects return of the 8100. That way it uses the same power amp sound. And in theory, that should help it as much as possible to sound like the 8100. If it's not going to sound like the 8100 in that application, then it's only going to sound more different in any other one. They advertise as being able to use this in front of a clean channel, but even Master Effects recommends you use this in a preamp configuration. And I would think that adding some EQ before or after, or even a boost pedal, would certainly react well. But for this apples to apples comparison, just this pedal alone is being used. And this should at least give us some insight to whether or not the preamp tube in this is important, because a lot of people say, well, the preamp tube isn't doing anything but volume, so that's not really the tone generator. So in theory, if this, copying the hard clipping section and substituting maybe an op amp with the tube functionality, if that sounds the same, then maybe that will prove one way or another what that tube is doing in the circuit without having to get full-blown electrical engineer on you guys. And our last contestant brings us full circle with the original Marshall hard clipper, the Guv'nor. As I pointed out in this video and the Valvestate videos, there's a lot shared in common between these two. They both have a hard clipping section utilizing red LEDs, which is not something you see very much, especially in this time period, but even today, other than stuff like the Turbo Rat or purpose-built clones of this, or at least using the architecture of this pedal. And it's kind of odd to see it in an amplifier used to such success. So the question I'm answering here, attempting to, is if we dissect this amplifier and just borrow different sections of it, can we recreate that with different gear? So I'm going to use the Guv'nor as kind of the front end of the Valvestate, dialing in the EQ and gain an output response as needed to tailor it as close as possible. Then put this in front of the low channel of the stock Cherrytone gargoyle. So I took out the hot mod for this, put in just the regular preamp tube, and basically this turns this into a lower gain, 2 gain stage, kind of plexi-ish 2204 style sound. Although this setup obviously lacks the onboard contour control, and this is something that you could make up for at the desk or with another EQ in the loop, I'm not going to do that because we have 2 passes of EQ to potentially make up for that difference. So we got mids here, we got mids there. You can kind of change the middle frequency target by adjusting treble as they do interact in that way. And as we shown in the Valvestate video, it actually really sounds like a tube power amp, because putting the preamp of this through the Cherrytone Gargoyle's power amp sounded basically identical to the amplifier on its own. So they were doing a really good job of emulating a lot of that negative feedback and characteristic of a clean tube power amp in this model. So with that, the big reveal of who's who, which one the 8100 was, and whether any of its competitors sounded as good or even surpassed it. I think the results of this little exercise might just be the most interesting of all of the blind shootouts I've performed, because there's such a disparity in cost between all these options, and there's a lot of overlap on different options that could be on way different sides of the cost scale, but there's also things that each one does better or worse than the other that sounds closer to this, and then in a completely different application, it doesn't sound anything like it. Whether you're palm muting or tremolo picking or playing notes higher up on the fretboard or lower down on the fretboard, they all kind of change and they have their own character. I'm really glad I ended up using two selections of riffs here to demonstrate this, and I'm sure if we'd gone even further, you'd hear more differences in how each one kind of behaves differently for those use cases. But for everything that was on show today, nothing, in my opinion, truly stacked up to what the 8100 did, at least not in every way. And that's not to say that the RG100 sounded bad in its own right, but if you were trying to do all those things that the Valvestate did, that still mid-range dominant, yet mid-range scoop sound, a little bit of boxiness on that low end without sounding too lo-fi or too cheap, that high-end sizzle without sounding too fizzy or too unbalanced. The whole package just is a 8100 signature sound that I don't think you can really replicate in every aspect. There are certain songs or certain playing styles that I think we did a pretty good job here getting close, but as a whole platform, for the $400 to even $600 used nowadays, which is kind of getting a little ridiculous, this is one of those few aging physical amplifiers that I can kind of recommend. If you're interested in this sound, it's only going to get harder and more expensive from here. And I think you should probably jump on it if you like what you heard and you agree with me that everything did a good job in its own way, but this was kind of the king in making that Valvestate sound. For the competition, I think it's most interesting to look at this from a lowest price to highest price perspective, because it kind of changes the calculation on how well each platform did, in my opinion. So first off, the Audiority plugin. Definitely a great value at $65 compared to a physical amplifier, especially if you don't have room or if you don't have the means to record it out loud or with a load box. I'm not factoring in the cost of all the other equipment I already have, and if you don't have that stuff, then it's kind of a no-brainer, right? But when it comes to the overall quality, while good, I wouldn't say it's great. I wouldn't say that it blew my socks off by any means compared to some emulations of real tube amplifiers, or even stuff like the Amplitube equivalent of the RG100 and the Dimebag Daryl suite. Never really touched on that much on the channel, but it does the job, and for all of its deficiencies and potentially aliasing or just the overall, emulation quality, I feel like stuff like that does get closer than this Audiority plugin did. And that's not to say that Solidus sounds bad by any means. I actually used it as my monitoring sound to record the DIs for this very video. It did sound that close. I think the most important thing compared to all the other offerings here is that it did have a very similar gain structure to the real amp. And so you can kind of play around with it even if there's deficiencies in other areas. But it does have a decidedly last gen quality to it, a boxiness, a high frequency aliasing that I think you're going to have to really work hard to sculpt around with EQ to make it work in a mixed environment. Whereas when you pair the 8100 with kind of typical speakers, it already sits in the mix sort of the way you want it to, and it's not really something you have to work hard to get it to sound right or high fidelity. Whereas the Solidus does kind of remind me of some free sounding plugins from years past. Again, it's workable, and you got to give it credit for being basically the only emulation of this thing, but it definitely doesn't get all aspects of it correct. The next most affordable option is the Master Effects Martyr, and I'm unfortunately a little disappointed with this pedal. In isolation, it's not that bad, and again, like I said earlier, if you pair this with EQ, I'm sure you could get it closer to the real amplifier, but I feel like this is something you shouldn't have to with the way that it's being advertised. I would prefer this pedal to be another $50 or $100 even, a little larger footprint, and sound closer to this amplifier than skimp on the cost, and it really just sound like a generic pedal. The contour control is nice. The tone stack, also decent. But neither one of those things, even through the same power amp, react the same. It, again, sounds very pedal-like in that manner. The gain structure is not nearly high gain enough. It does not have the tightness or high-end saturation you hear out of this. This sounds like a searing, hot, crunchy guitar tone that it sounds like it's being boosted already, and this does not. It doesn't even sound like it has a bright cap at all involved, let alone a very harsh clipping diode. So something is too smooth and too low gain in this circuit, and it very well may have to do with the fact that it is 9 volt only, may need a 18 volt or even 24, 27 volt power supply to be able to get the level of saturation that I expect. You can certainly hear tones in this pedal that the 8100 is capable of, but this is one of those instances where this pedal is not capable of what the amplifier can do and kind of misses some of the point. This, by comparison, sounds like, well, the typical derogatory things that a lot of people say about solid-state amplifiers. And if this is your first impression for what an 8100 is supposed to be, I think you're going to be a little disappointed and say, well, why the hell is all these idiots praise this amplifier? Just play a 5150. And that's not really fair to the amp, I think. So I think they need to rev up. I think they need to look, go back to the drawing board and see if their component values are correct, or if they're getting the correct gain or frequency response out of certain sections. Because if they just looked at the schematic, maybe that doesn't tell the whole picture. And potentially that tube in this circuit is doing a lot more than some people are giving it credit for, because going straight through the effects return obviously does not have that involved. So I want to like it. I really don't care for it though. With the real 8100 being in the lower middle of the road cost-wise, we actually arrived to the 8200, which I purchased obviously heavily used for about $550-ish all told with shipping included. So these are hard to find, damn near impossible to find. You see them sometimes on eBay and Reverb, but I basically jumped on this one as soon as I saw the price. And there's probably a reason for the price. I mean, it's missing the nut on the input, so the cable has to sit just right. That's one thing I need to repair. I actually had to remove the entire amp from the chassis and replace the preamplifier tube, because for whatever reason that was causing some intermittent cutting out on the power amplifier section on one channel. It didn't resolve it fully on another one, so still probably have some bugs to work out. I did inspect all the solder joints and the PCBs, and I didn't see anything wrong with it, but that doesn't mean there's not a blown component, as I didn't take a multimeter to every single component. So between that cost of ownership when it comes to time and potentially having to restore these kind of amplifiers, you are taking a gamble on both of these amps. I got really lucky with the 8100 in that the only things that were broken were the reverb tank and also an output IC on the power amplifier. And less than $100 of repairs later, I got it up to working order. This will probably need some similar work done if I want to get it to its full glory. The Tolex is like a mess up here. But for the cost, it is more capable in a lot of ways than the 8100. What it is not more capable at is that boost channel sound. Looking at the schematics, you would think that these two should sound basically identical. There are some small differences around the preamplifier gain stages, and I imagine that is contributing at least a little bit to the overall sonic differences, but one would think, at least with the hard clipping sections looking relatively the same, that these two would be closer to each other in sound. And they're simply not, at least mine isn't. And in every demonstration, and there's only a few of them online, I've been able to hear of this fully wide open, gain cranked. It kind of sounds this way. It kind of has this old school clipped bright cap 2203 character. It's really not that high gain. And I can totally see why Meshuggah boosted the shit out of these things for their rhythm sound live in the 90s, because by itself, it just doesn't do what the 8100 does, which is a bit disappointing because I would love this just to be stereo. So there's potentially some more deep dives I can do on the circuit on this to see if there is a problem, but I'm starting to think there's really not, because no one talks about the 8200 as it being the holy grail sound. It's all about this amp. So this one is not the best rhythm tone sound by itself, but with some help, I think it could be fine. As an investment to try to compete with the 8100 though, it's going to have to take an L today. The final two options can be relatively interchangeable in price depending on what gear you already have and have to buy. Or which side of the tonal spectrum you're coming from, so kind of talk about them together. The RG100 platform is by far the most complex. It's something that I'm kind of used to doing for an RG100 anyway, though, as generally speaking, I always have one or two EQ pedals hooked up to it, dime bag style, to get the sounds that you do out of it. So I don't think it's that much more of a hassle to make it sound closer to this amp. And I think, as far as the overall character goes, it's obviously missing a few special spices in that sound, but it, I think, is the closest competitor to the Valvestate, which makes sense. It's going about it in a different way, but ultimately they are still in sort of a similar solid state family. They both have similar tube-like output sounds coming from their power amp. So it's not shocking to me that with some sculpted EQ moves, you can get it a lot closer. And you probably say that for a lot of the amps on offer. If I boosted the shit out of it, then probably would have gotten closer. But the exercise here was to see, can transistors even sound the same as a hard clipper going through a tube preamp? And I think it can for the most part. Would I recommend buying an RG100 to do this with? No. But if you already have one and you're a dime bag fanatic or just have a couple EQ pedals lying around, you can probably get this 90s sound with a different 90s platform. So this could be as expensive as in the realm of $1,600 to $2,000 if you buy a perfect condition RG100 stack and these exact same pedals, or it could cost you chump change, $50 to $100 for an extra EQ pedal if you've already got the other stuff lying around, and you can get some glorious Valvestate style tones out of it. So I think it is an option that's worth considering depending on the gear you already have. But if you're starting from scratch, this is still the more attractive option. Finally, the Guv'nor. This one is also interesting because you can buy a cheaper used beat up example like I have, or a new reissue of the Guv'nor or even Drive Master, since it is essentially the same type of circuit. You put that up in front of a Marshall flavored amplifier like I did, and you can hear some fundamental similarities between the Valvestate 8100 and this approach. And that shouldn't be too shocking. Hard clipper in front of a tube preamp. So that's kind of cool. There are more tubes involved there, so there's definitely some more saturation, and the overall mid-range response of this pedal and even the amplifiers themselves in the post-EQ sense never quite get as scooped or boxy or grunty sounding as this amp, but I think a lot of people are going for that more vocal, wide open sound in the first place. So if you don't like that aspect of the Valvestate, this could be a cool alternative if you're just going for a little bit of a different flavor I think it's great to have a Guv'nor style circuit anyway. It's so mean in front of high gain amps, and it's a really great dirt box all around if you use it for that kind of in-between channel sound like an OCD or even a Klon on the higher gain settings. But evaluating it from a sheer cost example, for me personally, this is a $300-ish pedal going through an amplifier I paid close to $1,700 for, and costs are only going up now. It doesn't make sense at all when you could get a arguably closer sound with a $100 plug-in or just buy the real deal for $500-600. So I think there is something to be said about the whole circuit layout and how close we were able to get using this, but for the application of it, the cost of it, probably a better option. So I hope that was educational, informative, fun for you guys. Definitely scratched another nerdy itch for me when it came to the Valvestate series. Definitely look forward to some content on this big guy. And I just love the Valvestate. I appreciate it more and more every time that I play through these things, and keep being more impressed with how well the 8100 holds its own. It really is a special design that needs a reissue. I'll say that again. Thanks so very much for watching. Any other questions, comments down below? Let us know what your favorite example was, which ones you're considering, or if you have something that can get close that I did not show here. Thanks so very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.